We are going to speak in the following order. It will be Ryan Short, Dr. Nicky Black, and Mr. Boikobo Paya in that order. Over to you, Ryan.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and well done on those of you who've managed to stay the course to this session. It's been a very interesting and robust day, so I'm hoping that we can carry on that vein. So my name is Ryan Short, and I'm a development economist. I work with a consultancy called Genesis Analytics, based in Joburg. Genesis has, for many years, researched the role of minerals in development, and particularly around the role of diamonds in Botswana, both empirically, but also recently we've done a lot of qualitative research, speaking to many stakeholders, both government and private sector in Botswana. And I thought it would be interesting in the next 10 minutes or so just to give you an overview of some of the findings of that research. Now, with apologies, one of the themes that has come out very clearly to me, and as Mr. Moroka mentioned today, is that the history is known. Okay, the history is well appreciated. Botswana is correctly held up as an African success story historically, and there's very much, to me, a sense in this room of, yes, but what now? Where does Botswana go post-diamonds or in a transition from diamonds? So, with that in mind, I owe you an apology because most of my speech looks at the history. I'm sorry about that, but that was the brief that I've been given. All right, before going any further, I'd just like to take a straw poll across the room and ask who in the room feels that diamonds have had a positive impact on the economy of Botswana? All right, so for the record, that's probably about 80%. Does anybody feel that diamonds have had a negative impact on the economy of Botswana? Okay, for the record, nobody. And does anybody feel that it's a mixed bag, that there have been positives, but that there also have been adverse consequences? Okay, so 4 or 5 hands going up there. All right, that's very interesting. So look, I think as a starting point, I'd like to make it clear that our view is that the economic impact of diamonds has undoubtedly been highly positive. Okay, and I think it would be churlish to suggest otherwise. As we know, in 50 years, Botswana has, on the back of diamonds, transformed itself from a poor economy into a middle-income economy. And as a development economist, you look at that and you think that is a remarkable achievement. And it is one that correctly all Botswana and the government and De Beers and all of the parties that have been involved in making their reality should be very proud of. So, just as background, to our way of thinking, this economic development has really been built by applying a very simple formula. There are probably 7 parts to this formula. Number one, and this is touching, with apologies on some of the other speakers earlier today, but number one is to provide a political and a policy and a regulatory environment that is conducive to the long-term nature of investment in mining. That's been achieved. Number two, perhaps obviously, is to locate the diamonds and mine them efficiently. All right? This is not something that all countries have successfully achieved. The purpose of that is obviously to provide a steady supply to world markets. Number three, supply means very little without demand, and so part of that successful formula has been securing a growth in global demand, right? And I think De Beers have played a very important role in the partnership with government in achieving that. Number four is a fiscal and ownership regime that managed to capture a very high level of mineral rents. Number five was investing those rents in investment rather than consumption, in infrastructure, education, healthcare. Number six was tight fiscal control and careful planning of those rents. And number seven, as we heard from the session before, is trying to expand the diamond value chain, both upstream and downstream. All right, I'm not going to use a lot of slides, but I just have one slide, which is taken from the De Beers report, which is available in the foyer. So, look, I think it's important that let's look at the history a little bit, because it is worth repeating again for those that don't know the history of Botswana's development with diamonds. And what we have on the screen is effectively two graphs. Okay, the top graph, the black line, is the GDP of Botswana from 1960 to the present day. The yellow line is the improvements in the Human Development Index, which is a composite index that measures how long people live, income levels, and levels of education. So that's, it's another way of thinking about how good life is. And then below the x-axis, you have the carats on this scale that have been mined in Botswana since 1972. And I think it's, just looking at that, the similarities aesthetically in the carat production and GDP growth is quite striking. And, aesthetically, it's very clear to see the link, okay, including the dips in mining and how they link to the GDP of Botswana, but also the growth. And as carats come out the ground, it's driven the economy. Okay. If we start back in the 1960s, and this is some of the research that we did for the report that we helped De Beers with, the indicators were, for an outsider like me, really amazingly shocking. I had no idea that income levels in '66 were just $84 a head per capita. Minimal infrastructure. There's always this famous quote about, is it 5 kilometers or 8 kilometers or 12 kilometers of roads in a country which is actually bigger than Spain, highly dependent on foreign aid from Britain, surrounded on all sides by hostile minority regimes, very limited economic potential because of where the country is, and the nature of the climate, and probably most importantly, very low human development indicators. So we're talking about 40 university graduates in a population of 600,000, or one doctor, strikingly, for 47,000 people, one doctor. So the discovery of diamonds in '67 obviously turned those prospects around very rapidly. Interestingly, one of the things that we learned in the research was that almost didn't happen, and that De Beers, who had been prospecting at the time for 11 years, were just a few months, 3 months by one account, from giving up and saying, well, we're going to pull the plug on this, when the Arapa deposits were found. So just very, very quickly running through a sort of economic development lesson, the capital expenditure on the mines kickstarted an economy, especially sectors like construction, financial services, transport. But sectors not linked to mining also benefited greatly through the improved infrastructure and investment in human capital. We saw rapid economic growth take hold from the 1970s and 80s onwards. I think it's well known that Botswana was one of the most highly performing economies in the world for a 40-year period. And importantly, a tax and ownership regime that was put into place that allowed about, over 30 years, from 75 to 2005, we calculate about an average of about 45% of fiscal revenues came from mining. That in turn allowed a huge lift in government spending, which was prudently invested in infrastructure and in human capital. And so Botswana's development pattern took hold. And I think it's important to recognize that this is a pattern of mine, tax, redistribute. And that comes into play later when you start talking about competitiveness and productivity issues. That saw a rapid improvement in GDP per capita. You could see Botswana was right up there with some miracle states like Singapore and the Korean Republic in terms of its GDP per capita over this long-term period. And in turn, we saw importantly, a rapidly improving human development index. So you can trace that yellow line and see how it moves from about 0.5 to an index of 0.7. There's a long tail off in the 1990s as the HIV/AIDS pandemic took its toll on longevity. So, looking now back at those earlier statistics, 40 university graduates, now 11,000 graduates. 100 secondary school graduates now per year, 8,500 secondary school graduates. One doctor for 47,000 people, now one for every 3,300 people. So this is an overwhelmingly positive story, okay, and it definitely should not be forgotten. But there are 2 points to make. Firstly, I think the conversation is now moving to what next, okay, where to from here. And the second point I would just like to make is that this success story is not always balanced with a recognition of the limitations of diamond-led growth. So I think it's important to touch on that to provide some balance in this story. So what are the limitations? And it's important to understand that these are not necessarily failings, all right? It's that if you have a resource-led growth, then there are some resource-led consequences of that growth. So the most obvious is the dependency on diamonds. We developed on the back of diamonds. The flip side is we're dependent on diamonds. Now, as Keith Jeffress noted earlier, Botswana has been relatively successful in diversifying the economy, but where diversification has not taken place is on export revenue, where diamonds still account for, depending on the year, between 75% and 85% of exports. And also, there's still a high dependency on diamonds for taxation, for fiscal revenue. Okay, so that's one limitation of the model. The second is the question of Dutch disease. Now, it's become common received wisdom to say that Botswana has escaped the resource curse. And to a large extent, that is true. Implicit in that is an understanding that Botswana escaped Dutch disease. Now, Dutch disease is an economic condition where a resource leads to a rapid appreciation of the currency, and it makes other tradable sectors less competitive. I think in Botswana's case, Dutch disease through currency appreciation has largely been avoided through pegging the pula, through the Revenue Stabilization Fund, through the accumulation of international reserves, some very clever policies. And so the currency has not moved too far from fundamentals. But arguably, and what a number of stakeholders did point out to us, is that there may have been some Dutch disease, not through currency appreciation, but through wage inflation. And what this means is that the wealth of the diamond sector allowed relatively high wages to be paid in the diamond sector, and it also allowed relatively high wages to be paid in government. Now, the potential consequence of that was that it put inflationary pressure on other sectors, and it set the bar of expectation quite high about what people are prepared to work for in Botswana. And that may have, we haven't shown it empirically, but we think that may have influenced the competitiveness of the manufacturing and agriculture sectors. A third limitation, which is often not spoken about but should be acknowledged, is that with rapid economic growth, often comes a high levels of rapidly increasing inequality. And Botswana did, over this period of very high growth, also become a very unequal country, and it's now probably the third most unequal country in Africa. So, is that a negative side of diamond-led growth? No, I don't think so. I think it's a necessarily accompanying side of diamond-led growth. It could be summed up as one of the researchees said to us: diamonds have been good for everybody. There's no doubt about it, but they've been better for some. The final limitation, I think, which we should also acknowledge, is that with a model of mine, tax, redistribute, inadvertently or perhaps necessarily, it led to a large public sector. And that often does happen where you have a highly redistributive model of economic development, which in itself is not a problem. But the natural result arguably has been that there's been little pressing need to grow the competitiveness or productivity of the private sector. And some of the stakeholders that we spoke to said, asked the question, has Botswana been made complacent? All right, has it been lulled by the wealth of diamonds into not needing, like a Singapore, for instance, to derive its growth through improving competitiveness and improving productivity? There's also potentially, and this is not empirically shown, but it's a suspicion that one of the reasons for the skills mismatch, which the private sector often complains of at the moment, is that many young Botswana prepare themselves for the best job that they can get, which is in government, and tend to then study government-appropriate courses like public administration, rather than necessarily the skills that the private sector would need. So in summary, there's no doubt that diamonds have been an economic blessing for Botswana, and that Botswana's wise management of its natural assets and the economic and developmental impact of diamonds have been positive and should be celebrated. The main economic impacts, in conclusion, are the rapid growth of the economy, the huge growth of the fiscal base, an impressive provision of infrastructure and investments in human capital, and as a result, a base rising in the levels of human development in the last 50 years. The flip side of these are rising inequality, potentially a Dutch disease through a wage inflation, a dependence on diamonds for taxation and especially exports, and then a dependency on the state for rising income levels rather than competitiveness and productivity. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Our next speaker is Dr. Nicky Black, Head of Social Performance at De Beers, with responsibility for risk management and socioeconomic benefit, community relations, and sustainability reporting. Nicky is going to talk to us on harnessing business for socio-economic development. Nicky?
Honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I will keep my comments brief because I'm looking forward to what I expect will be a lively discussion afterwards. Ryan, I think, has set the scene nicely. I'm always reminded that if you want to go somewhere, it's good to know where you're starting from. And I think Ryan set a picture of some of the consequences of diamond-driven development. And I'd like to paint a picture for you of what today looks like, or certainly last year looked like, for the partnership in Botswana. So there is a view, increasingly promoted by the development community and by leading companies, that the greatest development impact business can have is through its core business activities. Now, this is different from CSR, or corporate social responsibility, in which companies focus on generating shareholder value and use corporate philanthropy to create stakeholder value, distribute that value. Needless to say that first, a business must do no harm. It must understand its impacts, and it must seek to mitigate them. It can only do that through engaging with stakeholders, applying due diligence, being innovative and working collaboratively to find ways to mitigate social risk and negative social impacts. So in what ways can business harness its core impacts, core activities for development impact? There are many, and I won't run through them all, but I'd like to focus on 4 core levers today. The first is the revenues a business pays to government. The second, the wages it pays to the people it employs, the investment it makes in their skills. The third, through the goods and services it purchases. And the fourth, and this is quite unusual, is through reimagining its core business model in how it sells its product and who it sells it to. Now, today, De Beers released a report, which is available in the foyer, and Ryan has already spoken to, and I do hope you'll pick up a copy, called Turning Finite Resources into Enduring Opportunity. And in this report, we set out at De Beers to explore and understand the economic contribution of the partnership between the government of Botswana and De Beers, both in the historical development of the country, which Ryan has touched on, and the role it plays today. We were supported by both Genesis Analytics in the historical development and in working with us on engaging some key stakeholders in Botswana, but also by PwC, who worked with us on analysing the accounts of the 4 entities within the partnership: Botswana, DTCB, De Beers Holdings, and De Beers Global Sightholder Sales. The findings in the report illustrate that through revenues, through employment and skills development, through procurement, and through increasing participation in the value chain, the partnership has taken steps to maximise the value created and generated from diamonds for the sustainable social and economic development of Botswana. So first, revenues. Government revenues represented by far the most significant contribution the business entities made to Botswana. The report shows that in 2014, the partnership paid a total of $2.2 billion to the government in the form of revenues, including taxes and royalties, representing a significant portion of total government revenue. For many stakeholders, however, paying tax is the least a business can be expected to do in terms of contributing to society. Which brings us to the second lever, investing in people. As we heard so eloquently from Mr. Bonyongo, and we'll hear from Mr. Paya soon, the partnership and the government have put human capital development at the center, as a central pillar of Botswana's economic development strategy. What we found was that in 2014, the partnership directly employed 8,000 people, including 2,000 contractors. For each of these 8,000 people, there are 8,000 individual stories of opportunities created, challenges overcome or not, and dreams realized. I work with many of them, and I am proud to. International companies, particularly in the extractive sector, sometimes get criticized for importing skilled labor at the expense of local citizens and communities. And what we have heard and what we saw in our analysis is that this is not the case with the partnership. 96% of those 8,000 employees are local citizens. 85% of management are local citizens. This is a direct result of government education policy and a commitment by the partnership to invest in skills and development training. Last year, over $6 million was invested in over 500,000 hours of skills training and development for the people employed by the partnership. This includes safety training, business process training, management training, technical training as artisans. Not only in helping people do their jobs, this training also instills skills and provides experience that people take beyond the partnership into their family life, their communities, into their futures. In addition, and as we heard, many of the leaders of this country have been supported by the bursaries provided by the partnership over the years to study at leading universities overseas. And many of them, when you speak to them, mainly they'll tell you how difficult it is to contend with the cold when you're sent to Albuquerque or you end up in Glasgow. But an incredible experience. But beyond paying taxes and building the skills of local employees, companies can catalyze development through the goods and services they buy and how they sell their product. And I'll touch on these two briefly. Building local enterprise through sourcing goods and services from citizen-owned enterprises has long been recognized as a way that business can support local economic development. And what we found was that in 2014, there was almost an equal split between international and domestic suppliers who were being procured, who were providing goods and services to the partnership entities. 5% locally, 4% internationally. Now, this broadly compares with the reported division of international to local expenditure for the South African mining sector. But you need to treat the numbers with caution. As a number of the stakeholders we spoke with during the engagements on the findings of the research noted, the local manufacturing sector in Botswana is underdeveloped, and we've discussed diversification throughout the day. Many locally registered suppliers are possibly or probably distribution centers for overseas companies rather than local manufacturers, and this is a challenge recognized by many. So to support greater participation by Botswana in providing goods and services, each of the partnership businesses has either an approach or a formal program around local procurement, particularly around supporting citizen-owned enterprises. For example, last year, Botswana's development program actively assessed and registered 134 citizen-owned enterprises in their supply chain system. And it's to support these businesses that De Beers, Botswana, Anglo-American, and the government established Tokafala, which launched, as we heard earlier, in the beginning of 2014. And I'm sure that I speak for the other corporate founders by saying how proud we are and pleased with the progress that Tokafala has shown over the first 22 months, supporting over 150 enterprises, 1,200 jobs. We feel it's very clearly a proof of concept, and we look forward to seeing it grow into the future. And lastly, business has the potential to drive development through increasing local participation in the value chain, and we heard a discussion about the successes and challenges of beneficiation before the coffee break. So taken together, the analysis shows that the partnership directly contributes $4 billion to the Botswana economy. That's 25% of GDP. When indirect and induced economic contribution is included, it goes to 27% of GDP, and supported in turn 1 in 20 jobs. Now, this is not to say that more cannot be done to harness the development impacts of business. Tokafala is one example of continuing efforts in this area, but we'd hope that in providing robust analysis of the contribution the partnership businesses made last year to the economy of Botswana, in revenues, in employment and skills development, in local procurement, enterprise development, and in beneficiation, the report provides critical support for the argument that the core development impact of business is through harnessing core business activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicky. Our next speaker is Mr. Boikobo Paya, who is currently the Director of International Linkages and Partnerships at the Botswana International University of Science and Technology. He's also presently a board member of African Copper. He is the immediate former permanent secretary at the Ministry of Minerals, Energy and Water Resources, and has been chairman at the Diamond Trading Company, and also served on the boards of Botswana and the DBS Group. Over to you, BK. He's going to talk on skills transfer and human capital building.
Good afternoon, or should I good evening. What I'm going to do is just run you through some slides, and those slides will basically be the ones that are communicating. I'll just pick out some areas that I think are where the graphs are telling a story. And to make sure that Dr. Kidikula doesn't catch me unaware, I'll try to indicate upfront what I think where we need to focus. And I'm hoping that Balis, you'll also be taking notes to see how you can help. Technologies, do you know? God. I thought what I will lay out up front is to try to get an agreement that as a country we need to be a knowledge society or a knowledge-driven economy. I think that's what I want to put forward before I give you a few statistics in terms of where we're coming from and where we are and where I think we ought to be going. Simply because I think it's important for us to understand that the knowledge society, basically, it means a society that is based on knowledge from a holistic approach that empowers and enriches people. This is very, very important. The participation of people, okay? And it's an integral part of sustainable development. It is a learning society that is committed to innovation. And here it's across all the sectors. It doesn't matter whether it's the beef industry, it's the farming industry. When you talk about genetically modified crops, these are areas that we need to be openly as a society, we need to be discussing. I think it is also a fact that is generally accepted now, that amongst policymakers and economies, that at least half, if not more, of the economic growth in countries is directly attributable to science and technology. I think for Botswana it's even more so, whether we're talking the diamond industry, the tourism industry, the cattle industry. I was just having a short discussion with one of the big farmers around a few minutes ago, Moroka, talking about the drought that we always talk about in this country. To say, are we not aware that every year there will be drought? Do we really have drought, or do we have range management challenges? So this is what I'm trying to put forward. So in a globalizing, knowledge-driven world, the importance of science and technology becomes even more important. I think I just want to lay this up front because I think in terms of the future for this country, this is where we need to ponder and see if what we can do to really move in this direction. I'm obviously working for the university, and the university is obviously sponsored by the Ministry of Education. So I have to be seen to be marketing what the good work that the ministry is doing. And clearly where we are today, which is what Moroka has been trying to say to us, we know that we have made progress. Tell us the way forward. But I have to sort of highlight some of the progress that is there. I think a lot has been said about the 3 secondary schools in 1966. And I, on the break, asked Rekiri Kilwe how many primary schools was there. He said there were a number, but they were just trees. So now we do have 755 primary schools, and as you can see, this is information that is just for you to take away. And I've not included the 2 universities that we have and all the private colleges that we have in Botswana. Now, these are areas that we need to start looking at, because if we talk about knowledge society or knowledge-driven economy, what it means is it doesn't matter where you are. Are you in New Kadi or in Kamuchujina? The school or the student who was attending there must be part of the knowledge society. Now, let's do a quick evaluation. The data that I got is that all the schools, junior schools, 207 of them are electrified. That's a good start, because we can now start talking about installing computers, bring Wi-Fi to those schools. All the senior schools, 32 of them have been electrified. I couldn't get full data on the primary schools that have been electrified, but I have a rough idea that at least 33% of them have not been electrified, because we have linked the grid power to the electrification of schools, which in a knowledge society should not happen, because we know that with solar, we can still power those schools. Junior secondary schools come into computers. As you can see, we are in 2015-16. We are looking to cover all the 207 schools. Currently, only 30 schools have been installed with computers, and 150 are in the pipeline, and hopefully will be completed by the end of 2015-16. Now, clearly, that's an area that we need to ponder and start reflecting on. Maybe it's an action item there which should be immediate, and for even a bigger difference to be made by the partnership, maybe we need to do something about that. Yes, all senior secondary schools, all the 32 of them have computers. I didn't get data on actual Wi-Fi or internet services in those schools. But I want to emphasize, for us to move to the next level in terms of indeed a knowledge-driven economy, that's where we need to start. Because in Singapore, in Finland, and South Korea, as we speak, every child has access to internet, has e-learning as part of their development or education. I do have some statistics that I want to share with you, also again to just show progress in terms of what the ministry has achieved in terms of skills development or education, if I was to put it in a simple way. The trend is generally upward, as you'll see with most of the indicators or the measures that I'm going to bring out. And I'm using the tertiary education as an area where I'm doing the measurement. So for the sake of time, I will not be going into measurement in the secondary schools or other areas. I'll just be focusing more on the tertiary and the transitions from the secondary schools to the tertiary levels. So generally, there's an increase. You can see in 2003-04, we're at about 20,000 in terms of enrollment, and we are currently at over 60,000. I think that's a big positive trend. The kick that you see there, just for your information, is a lag measure which was a result of the economic downturn of 2008-2009. This is an area that I just want to share with you because it's a busy slide, but please just focus on the engineering, manufacturing, and construction, vis-a-vis humanities and arts, education, social sciences, business and law, especially social sciences. But in short, 25% of enrollment in our schools is in engineering, manufacturing, and construction. Science does has an impact, but just for your information, that 1,131 is almost 800, 900 is all IT, which is a positive thing. But you'll probably know that a lot of our IT graduates are actually in the street. But the point here that I just want to pick up, and something to try to look at for the future, is how do we pick up that number of engineering, manufacturing, and construction, and science to a certain extent. I think that's, if we want to move to the knowledge economy driven, we need to be focusing on that and seeing what is it that we need to do to drive that. Unfortunately, because of time, I could not put a graph that shows the trend, but for those who are interested, I can provide that. You will see that for the past 10 years, the trend has exactly been the same. Nothing has changed. So effectively what we are doing is we are churning out degrees, we are educating our children, but we are not focusing on the marketplace. There's an issue there that maybe for the future we need to look at. I thought it is also interesting to look at what they call a gross tertiary enrollment ratio. This is just an international standard that you use for an age group of 18 to 24 vis-a-vis the enrollment that you have. So it doesn't matter whether the 18-year-old or the 19-year-old is at the cattle post or is doing whatever he's doing wherever. You just take in the enrollment that you have and you take the population of that age and you say, those who are at the school, as a ratio of that population, what does it give you? Obviously, as you can see, there's a significant improvement because this graph is related to the other graph that I was showing you, which was the enrollment curve. But the interesting thing here is there's a big question mark, at least to me, and I think you can also have that question. If we are now at 21.3%, where is the 79? Is it 79? Yeah, 78.7%. Where is the 7? And maybe more specifically, if we have enrolled 60,583 youth at our institutions, where is the 18 years to 24-year-olds balance from that 284,282? I think this is an area that, as I was doing this for purposes of this conference, I was struck, and I would like to pursue the investigation in that regard. I think, is that clear? Is that something that you understand? But we can pick up during the discussion anyway. Basically, there is a group of 18 to 24 years, and all you do is you look at how many of those are at universities, tertiary, and and all that, and you say, what's the percentage of that age group? Yes, there was the issue of competitiveness that Moroka picked up. If you look at how other countries are performing, and in this case, what HRDC has done is they've picked these 4 countries, and as we can see, our competitiveness here is still questionable. If you look at the Mauritius ratios, it's reasonably high. Yes, again, there is another measure that I wanted to bring up, which also brings some questions in terms of what's happening in our country. This one is a simple transition rate. Our students who have written what we'll normally call BGSE or Form 5, the rate of their progression to tertiary. And as you can see, there is improvement again, but still, if you pick the 2015 one, 2014-15, which is 64.28%, there is still the backing of the question, where is the 35.72%? Where are they? Remember the other question that we asked earlier about the 284,000 versus the 60,000. So, in short, the statistics seems to indicate that we are having more and more of our youth going into the street as we go through these stages, whether you are transforming from Form 5 to tertiary, or even during the high school days. However, if we were to do a measure using the The expenditure in terms of how much money we are putting in, obviously, is significant. 2005-06, we're at 4 billion. By 2009-10, we're already at about 9 billion, and we have sort of stayed there for some time. 2014-15, we crossed the 10 billion. So in terms of the investment that we are putting into education, there is no doubt that if we keep going with the message of the partnership, there is significant investment. The question is the return on that investment. Obviously, we do graduate, and these are sort of the numbers that you can look at. And again, I just want you at your own leisure, if you do, I'm sure you'll have this presentation, to just do a little bit of analysis in terms of the science, engineering, manufacturing and construction versus humanities, for example, art. There's more detail on this that HRDC have done in terms of segregating more the engineering, manufacturing and construction, the humanities and all that, and it gets even more interesting when you go deeper into that. But the bigger question is, 15,594 graduates in 2014, where did they end up? And we know that the youth unemployment is very high. Most of these graduates, at least up to 30% of them, don't actually make it into the workplace. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of work that is being done in terms of the sector plans that HRDC is looking at. Basically, I was interested in looking at how does the marketplace actually look like from a demand-supply perspective. And unfortunately, this is work that is still in progress. I was interested in looking at what does the labor force really look like, because I would like to put, the last one was done in 2005-16, 2005-2006, and the other one was launched recently, for those of you who probably remember the last week or two, this was launched. Unfortunately, without up-to-date data in this area, the strategic direction or decision in terms of which way to go becomes a little bit difficult, and obviously I'm unable to really give you my analysis of which way to go. But with those results coming up, we should be able to come up with a better strategy. I'm going to quickly just let you know that one of the key issues under knowledge economy driven countries is research and development. And I'm just going to beg the chairman to give me 2 minutes to go through this, because more especially that Honorable Nonoformolif is here. His ministry has been doing a good job looking at what is happening in the research and development area, because normally we'll talk about skills transfer, education, training, and in the process we forget this very important component in terms of if we really want to be a knowledge-driven economy. We do have the numbers as they are, and as you can see also areas of research. I was very interested in the science again, and you can see the natural sciences, which is your biology, your zoology, and those areas. The key areas, Rebalisi, in terms of research in metallurgy, in prospecting, in geology, is very low. And obviously, that begs the question, what's next? Expenditure in terms of research, 283 million, and if you bring that down to, let me just go to some interesting area. If you bring that down to a ratio, which is basically that GERD, is basically the gross expenditure on research and development. That helps you to do your comparative analysis once you bring it down to there. Botswana is at 0.26. What does the international, oh, what have I done now? The interesting slide was coming up. Is it going to come? What I did was I compared that ratio to especially the progressive nations. Let me just give you the figures, because it's an interesting discovery. If you look at how, for example, Finland is the top one. It is at 3.89, and Botswana, as you could see, was at 0.26. If you pick another one like Singapore, these are very progressive nations, it's at 2.09. And of course, like I said, Botswana is below Zambia, it's below Tanzania, it's below Mozambique. I think this is an area that we need to focus on. And the data shows that private sector is contributing almost zero to the research and development funding. And I was going to share with you what we are proposing in terms of how we can move Botswana to to become a knowledge-driven economy. But let me just do some conclusions here. One, there are no researchers in Botswana, or there are very few. How can we resolve that? We can resolve that by increasing the number of postgraduate. Remember, in the other statistics, clearly there are very few postgraduate students in Botswana. The proposal is that we increase the postgraduate and they do what is called applied research rather than academic research. It will achieve two things. It will upskill those students, but at the same time, it will give us a lot of knowledge. Most of them, as we speak, are roaming the street with their degrees. So if we were to, that's an opportunity for the partnership to look at. Innovation capability, I was going to share with you the global competitiveness. 2013-14, we rated 102 out of 142 countries. So in short, drastic measures are needed for achieving a knowledge economy. I have to share with you the model that I wanted to share because it's a very important model. Is this going back off? This is going to be the conclusion. This you can have a look at your own ledger. But what I want to share with you is the final slide, because I think it's very important for the industry here for us to discuss this. What we would like to propose between our BUST and BIH, which is Botswana Innovation Hub, basically what prevails is that Botswana Innovation Hub is innovating and hosting innovation industries. We are proposing incubation as opposed to innovation. We are saying, as a university of research, we can generate a lot of projects in terms of research and in terms of technology. So we would rather have incubation, which will eventually lead to innovation. We are proposing to the Minister of Infrastructure, Science and Technology that he creates a national research fund and an innovation fund, because the youth have got very brilliant minds. They can take advantage of this. And the industry can come in and we can work together to pick up startups and in the process diversify the economy, and there will go the diamond revenues. Thank you.
Your Honor, I thought that politicians took the trophy when it came to the issue of speaking for too long, but I think the academics are beginning to outdo us. Thank you, BK. This one is not working. Thank you, BK, for that insightful presentation. We'll have about 10, 12 minutes of questions. Yeah, 10 minutes of questions. I think the previous group took a lot of time, so our time was short, but of course, BK has taken a lot of time. Questions? The gentleman there, and then the lady.
My name is Muzon Kodi from Chatham House. My questions are addressed to Mr. Short. You mentioned, and rightly so, the issue of inequalities. How, from your perspective as a development economist, Botswana can address this issue that may risk to jeopardize all the progress that has been made over the years? And also, you talked about talking to stakeholders, but you only mentioned government and the private sector. Did you talk to the main beneficiaries, the communities and the citizens? If you didn't, why was that?
Yes, ma'am? Are you okay to me? Okay, there's a gentleman in the middle there.
Thank you. My name is Hepisi Pambe from the University of Botswana. Mine is a comment and a question. One of the things, Paya, which is coming out clear is that in terms of enrollment is going up, both from lower levels up to tertiary. But what you didn't mention, which is quite important and is also probably contributing to low productivity and other issues, is the quality aspect. And I think we need to deal with the issue of quality. And I'm just trying to pick from your side what you think are the key issues in terms of quality of education, which we need to address as we move to a knowledge-based economy. Thank you.
There's a gentleman right here who had his hand up.
Ross Harvey from the South African Institute of International Affairs. Ryan, thanks very much.
Could you just raise your voice, please?
Yes, sure. My question is directed at Ryan. Thanks for a very informative presentation. I do think there's merit to this analysis that diamond revenues have created a disincentive for innovation and an over-expenditure on public sector expansion. And so just off the cuff, I mean, looking forward, how would you say one essentially reverses that? What strategic moves do you now take, aside from some of the things that have been covered, to ensure an incentive for innovation, really?
Any further questions? This honorable, His Honor, the former Vice President, and the gentleman up there. Reki Dikilwe.
Thank you, Chairman. The insightful observations and presentation, Paya. The issues, without playing with words, around innovation and incubation. Why do you suspect that they may not be mutually inclusive? Because they are, to me, both desirable. I would like to volunteer to answer partially the question just asked by Professor from the university. I think one of the key elements in improving the quality of education is serious concentration on early childhood development. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And
thank you. We have another question from Twitter from Victor Monghai, who has asked, has the private sector played their role in helping the government to produce graduates that are relevant to the market?
thank you. Could we start answering? All right. Yeah.
So thank you. I think, so firstly, just to deal with the question of the stakeholder consultations, you correctly note that the stakeholders that were engaged with for the study were primarily from government and from the private sector. And you're correct that the study was framed at a national level and not at a community level. And I think it was always an intention that there may be scope for the impact of mining at a community level as well as at a national level. We did, however, meet with a number of NGOs, who about 12, who are active at the grassroots level to try and get some input from the less represented in the economy. With the question of inequality, I mean, I think that's such a complex question about how to deal with inequality, and I really don't feel like I could do that justice now. But I mean, except to say that there are probably two strands that top of head come to mind. The first is for the very poor, so those that are really at the bottom end of the spectrum, are more social transfers. All right, so we in South Africa, where I'm from, we've made a big dent at the very poor level, at the very poor end of the spectrum, through increasing social transfers, and that's lifted a lot of people out of absolute poverty. Then, for those that are not available for or eligible for social transfers, to my experience, the best way of dealing with inequality is job creation. And then that comes back to the question of unemployment and ultimately the competitiveness of Botswana's various sectors. There was another question about. Oh, sorry. I think Ross, you asked about.
Yes, Ross, you asked the
you
question.
asked about the inflation potentially of the size of the public sector and how to rebalance that. Look, again, that's another a big question. Obviously, the most obvious way is to stop hiring in the public sector, but ultimately that's not going to happen until the private sector becomes more competitive. So you're back to this question of competitiveness again, and I stand to be corrected, but I do think that there's now quite strong wage control actually on the public sector in Botswana, and that I'm not certain that the government is that wage bill is overinflated. So those are very simple answers to very complex questions.
Nicky, any response from you?
Thank you. Is it?
Or is it? You wanna go BK now? Or
Yes,
shall I-
yes,
okay,
I'll
go
go.
ahead, yeah.
Quality, I agree, Prof, that there's an issue of quality, which obviously feedback from the industry will be useful. However, I prefer a more proactive approach to assuring quality rather than the reactionary approach. And I'll say one of the major challenges, I think, in universities or even at high school, I think Reggie Gilo has answered the other part, which is the preschool, is the quality of the trainer. I think that's where the whole issue of quality in terms of guaranteed quality begins, and it's a totally different investigation altogether. But getting to the university side, I think, or tertiary side, I think there is a big disconnection between the institutions and the industry at all the stages of the institutions, whether they are at the curriculum development or at the actual delivery of the subject matter. The institutions' collaboration with the industry is very limited, if at all is there. I think that's a major challenge that we see. So we deliver, or institutions deliver graduates without knowing what the industry really requires. Some graduates graduate without having been to industry in terms of attachment and all that. I think that is where the issues of quality and detachment in terms of the requirement of the private sector. That brings me to the issue of the graduate relevant to the market. The only way the universities or the institutions can bring out graduates that are relevant to the market is if there is close collaboration between the institutions and the industry. And I think in this country, it's a major challenge. And the model that we are putting forward, which we're talking about incubation, in terms of, I don't also want to play with words, doctor, but all we are saying is, you need to start thinking of institutions like University of Botswana, BUST and other institutions who are looking at research from an industry perspective. You don't do a research project that just comes from your initiative as a university or as an institution. It has to be driven by the needs of the industry, which means that the industry must be saying, we have a gap here, and then you are working to close that gap. That will then lead to research and development that leads to prototypes. That will then lead to prototypes that are actually tested, which is where the incubation comes in. And by the time they are commercially viable and they are innovation and they get into the industry, they're actually creating positive results for the industry. I think, for me, this is the model that I think for Botswana we need to adopt. It doesn't matter whether it's in agriculture or it's in business development or it's in geology or whatever. It has to be industry based and therefore must originate as a gap in terms of the delivery of the industry.
Nicky, anything wrong?
Yes, two small points I'd pick up on from what's been a fascinating discussion. The first is around the question on engaging communities on the report's findings. We didn't through this process actively, but I'm mindful of Dorothee's presentation this morning around the importance of stakeholder engagement. And it's something that De Beers has been focused on formalizing more around how we work with communities over the last 3 years through our social and economic assessment toolkit approach. And certainly Botswana over the last 2 years has been building on their frequent and ongoing engagement with the communities around the 3 main operations, been formalizing that in a structured stakeholder engagement process, and the report from that will be out soon. The other piece I'd pick up on around the challenge of inequality, and particularly Ryan's point around job creation being the most powerful driver of reducing the Gini coefficient and inequality. And here I think there is a role for Tokafala for us not to miss. There are already micro-enterprise programs in place run by the government, and through taking Tokafala to scale in partnership with the government over the next 3 years, we would look to be providing support, particularly around micro-enterprises in rural areas, which we hope will go some small way to assisting that job creation.
Thank you, Nicky. That concludes this session. Thanks, Ryan, Nicky, and BK. A round of applause for them, please.